Romulus was dead, taken by the gods and transcended into divinity. The founder of Rome had led his people and city through many hardships and trials. Wars had been fought, conquests had been made, and the new city had established itself as more than a mere meeting point for the common rabble as it was first believed. Romulus had built his city, created a political system consisting of himself and the Senate. Romulus had also constructed temples, assembled an army, and set into the use a system to divide his people into manageable groups. Rome and its people had a lot to thank him for, and now he had disappeared in a mysterious way. The future for the young city looked uncertain. The people needed a new leader to follow. Rome needed a new leader, a monarch to guide its spirit into the future. In the 37th year after the founding of Rome, on the 5th of July, Romulus was holding a public sacrifice at the Campus Martius near the March of Capra, the Goat's March. The Senate and people of Rome were assembled before their king as the sky began to darken. A great dark cloud fell upon the march, and in this chaos the people, being frightened, began to flee and disperse. When the storm had disbanded, the monarch of Rome was gone. Romulus had disappeared. His body would never be found. Suspicion after the disappearance of Romulus quickly began to implant itself into the people of Rome, and it was aimed at the patricians. It was believed that the Senate had grown tired of kingly government, that they wanted to rule themselves, without a monarch to look over their shoulders. The population began to suspect that the patricians had plotted against Romulus' life or made him disappear. The Senate was quick to answer these allegations by giving Romulus divine honors. Romulus had not died, they argued. He had simply transcended into a higher condition to live amongst the gods. There was even one patrician, a man named Proculus, that took an oath saying that he had witnessed Romulus being carried into heaven with his arms and vestments still attached to his body. As he had ascended, Proculus had heard his king cry out that they should hereby style him not Romulus, but as Quirinus, his new divine name. The people of Rome would after this build a temple to their new god Quirinus, to honor him forever. The Senate, having put to rest the allegations aimed towards them, still had more pressing matters, arguably more so than the murder suspicion. They had to elect a new king. This election, as it would turn out, would be easier said than done. Romulus had been a great king, but he had not managed to stop the growing factionalism in the government. Jealousy had cemented itself in the Sabine faction aimed at the Romans, who saw themselves as better than the other tribe they now had shared their city with for some time. The Romans argued that they had given much to the Sabines. Had they not yielded part of their lands and houses to the Sabines? They were also the builders of the city and had been there with Romulus at the start. No, they would never accept those who had benefited so much from the Romans to end up ruling over them. The Sabines, on the other hand, argued that after the death of their king Cassius, they had willingly submitted to the sole command of Romulus. The Sabines did not see themselves as inferior to the original population. Without themselves, the city could scarcely be called a city in the first place. They saw it as their right to now be able to elect a Sabine king. The Romans wanted to elect Proculus, who had witnessed the transcendence of Romulus into godhood. Meanwhile, the Sabines wanted Velessus, who was most likely a highly esteemed member of their own tribe. It was decided in the meantime of the Senate's bickering to each day let one senator be given the ensigns of royalty. This senator would rule for just one day. 6 hours during the day and 6 hours during the night he would conduct the necessary rituals and dispatch public business. After this day he would become a private citizen once more. This would continue, each day letting a new senator be elevated to the status of kingship, until an actual king could be agreed upon. The Romans gave the name of this government interregnum, the time between kings. More than this, the Senate was also divided into 10 decuries, with a leader for each decury. These decuries would rule and do the work of the different functions of government. This way, the senator that carried the royal insignia for the day didn't have to micromanage everything connected with rulership, which he would not have the time for before he would let the next senator take over the reins of government. The decuries would stabilize the government, while the leading senator would concern his rule with the pressing matters of his appointed day. This interregnum would last for about a year. The Senate saw it as a modest way of ruling, but the people once again eyed them with suspicion. They believed that the senators were in fact just morphing the government into an oligarchy, and that they were set on never electing a new king. The Senate, now understanding that they had to speed up the process of the election, came to the conclusion that the people of Rome would elect one of the senators as king. This way, the senators made it look like they were giving away power to the people, but this power came right back into their own hands after one of them had been elected king. The commoners of the city were delighted, so delighted in fact that they wanted to show no less generosity than the Senate had. The people of Rome thus passed a resolution that the election of the king should be decided by the Senate. The senators, still being in the same difficult position now as before, came up with a new idea. One of the factions should choose a king from the opposite one. This way, the king would have loyalty to both of the factions. One had elevated him, and the other would be of his own people. The Sabines were keen to let the Romans decide on who should be king, and the Romans were in fact more inclined to receive a Sabine king chosen by themselves, rather than one of their own picked by the Sabines. Having now been given the power to elevate a king, the Romans hailed Numa Pompilius as their new monarch. Numa had a high reputation of excellence, and although he was not currently living in the city, the Sabines were fast to accept the choice, with loud acclamations. After telling the people of the Senate's choice, a group of them, both Sabines and Romans, were given the task of visiting Numa and entreat him to accept the government of Rome. Numa was at this time living in Cures, a Sabine city. He was the youngest of 4 siblings and born to his father Pomponius on the 21st of April, the day that Romulus founded Rome. Numa was described as having a soul disposed to virtue, never faltering to temptations. He had subdued his desires by practicing discipline and with the study of philosophy. Numa was of the opinion that true bravery consisted of subjugating our passions by reason. He had banned all forms of luxury from his home, and during his private times he devoted himself to the worship of the gods, contemplating on their divine power and nature. Because of these reasons, Numa was seen as an incorruptible judge and great counselor. Numa's fame had grown to such heights that Cassius, the previous king of the Sabines, had chosen Numa as his son-in-law and gave him his only daughter in marriage. Numa, being given these honors, had still chosen to live amongst his people, taking care of his elderly father rather than move to Rome and experience its luxury. Tatia, Numa's new wife, also preferred her husband's company in the city of Cures instead of the splendor she would have been shown at Rome with her father as joint king with Romulus. Numa would live with his wife for 13 years before she would pass away. After this, he would isolate himself to a solitary country life, visiting the groves and fields consecrated to the gods. It was believed, though, that Numa had done this not from sorrow of his wife's passing, but instead because he had experienced the joys and honor of an elevated intercourse and wedlock with the goddess Egeria. Numa himself admitted to spending much time loving and conversing with his new divine wife, attaining blessedness and wisdom from her. Numa was 40 years old when the Roman ambassadors came to give him the ensigns of royalty. The speakers of the group visiting Numa were Proculus and Velesus, both who had had their own side argue for themselves to become king before it had been decided that Numa would be given that honor. They made a small speech offering Numa kingship, believing that it was a title that needed no persuasion to be accepted. They found themselves baffled when Numa, a peaceful man, was hesitant to accept their offering to become king of a city that had been birthed and grown in violence and war. Numa answered their entreaties with this: "Every alteration of a man's life is dangerous to him, but madness only could induce one who needs nothing and is satisfied with everything to quit a life he is accustomed to, which, whatever else it is deficient in, at any rate has the advantage of certainty over one wholly doubtful and unknown. Though indeed the difficulties of this government cannot even be called unknown. Romulus, who first held it, did not escape suspicion of having plotted against the life of his colleague Tatius, nor the Senate the like accusation of having reasonably murdered Romulus. Yet Romulus had the advantage to be thought divinely born and miraculously preserved and nurtured. My birth was mortal. I was reared and instructed by men who were known to you. The very point of my character that are most commended marked me as unfit to reign. Love of retirement and of studies inconsistent with business. A passion that has become inveterate in me for peace, for unwarlike occupations, and for the society of men whose meeting are but those of worship and of kindly discussions, whose lives are in general are spent upon their farms and their pastures. I should but be, methinks, a laughingstock, while I should go about to inculcate the worship of the gods, and give lessons in the love of justice and the abhorrence of violence and war, to a city whose needs are rather fit for a captain than for a king. The Roman ambassadors, after having heard Numa's speech, were terrified that he would decline their offer to make him king. The Senate would once again fall into bickering factionalism, and the population would for each day grow more weary until they decided to revolt. Numa's father and one of his friends, who was also present, then spoke up and said, "Though you neither desire riches, being content with what you have, nor court the fame of authority, as having already the more valuable fame of virtue, yet you will consider that government itself is a service to the gods, who now calls out into action your qualities of justice and wisdom, which were not meant to be left useless and unemployed." They continued to argue that it was better for a people set on war and violence to be held back by a moderating hand, or that maybe now, when Rome and its people already had experienced so much warfare, now longed for a peace-loving prince. It is said that going along with these arguments, omens began to show themselves to further cement that Numa should accept the petition. Numa, after understanding that both gods and men wanted him to be king, finally accepted the crown and set off for Rome. Arriving at the city, Numa was greeted by the Senate and people. It is said that every temple in Rome held a sacrifice for his honor. He descended into the forum where the senator Spurius Vettius, the current interrex for the day, put Numa's kingship to the vote. All declared and hailed him as their new king. The robes of authority and the royal regalia were brought to him, but Numa rejected them until he had been confirmed by the gods themselves that he should be the new monarch. Numa ascended the Tarpeian hill, followed by the priests and augurs of the city. The chief of the augurs covered Numa's head, turning his face towards the south, and standing behind him put his hand on Numa's head and started praying. The augur looked for a sign. A silence fell over everyone who was assembled on the hill, and then some auspicious birds appeared before them. Numa descended the hill in his royal regalia. He had now become a holy king. The year Numa became king was 715 BC. The first thing he would do as king was to dismantle the Celeres, Romulus' personal bodyguard. Numa said that he would not distrust the people that had placed their confidence in him, nor would he rule over a people that distrusted him. Next, Numa created a new priesthood that would honor Romulus in the new temple dedicated to him. Numa called it the Flamen Quirinalis. This priesthood would work alongside the two already established ones, serving Jupiter and Mars. Both of these rulings gave Numa the affection of the Roman populace, but the next thing he was about to do would be of a grandeur undertaking. Numa would tame the violent Roman spirit and morph it into a more gentle and civilized temper. To turn the Romans away from war, Numa would instead focus their attention on religion. He increased the amount of sacrifices, introduced more processions and religious dances, mixing holy practices with human pleasures to increase the people's interest in the gods and to mitigate their warlike minds. Numa also filled the people's minds with religious terrors by professing that strange apparitions had been perceived in the area and that dreadful voices had been heard. These supernatural fears would work towards subduing the people's minds and give them an increased respect towards all things spiritual. Numa would also outlaw the depiction of gods as men or beasts, for in his opinion they were incorruptible and invisible, as well as changing the sacrifices to not involve blood, but instead wine and flour, so that all people could participate easier with the materials they would have at hand. Numa wanted the sacrifices and rituals in Rome to be laborious but not costly. If the people and senators had to spend a lot of time in their service to the gods, they would have less time for decadence, violence, and crime. Every ritual also had to be perfect. If anyone misspoke or any error was made, the whole ordeal had to be restarted from the beginning. There is a telling of one ritual that had to be repeated 30 times until the priest could get it perfect and up to Numa's standards. During his time as king, Numa would describe how he continued to meet the goddess Egeria, who is sometimes described as a mountain nymph. He would also talk about how he would hold conversations with the muses, the goddesses of literature and the arts. To these muses, Numa credited the greatest part of his revelations and told the Romans to venerate Tacita the Silent, who had gotten her tongue ripped out by Jupiter after she had warned a nymph that Jupiter planned to rape her. Numa held Tacita high, for she inspired man to silence and confidentiality, something that was lacking in the violent and turbulent Roman society. It is also said that Numa wrote and created the original constitution of the city's priests, the pontifices. These pontifices were called so after the word potens, meaning powerful. It was the duty of the pontifices to conduct religious rituals and sacrifices. The chief priest, or the Pontifex Maximus, which Numa was the first of, were to interpret divine law. He would also preside over sacred rites, decide the rules for public ceremonies, and regulate private rituals. The Pontifex Maximus were also the guardian over the Vestal Virgins, also an institution that Numa created. The Vestal Virgins were maidens who had taken an oath of virginity for 30 years. The first 10 years of their service, they would study and learn their duties. The second term of 10 years, they would perform them, and in the last term, they would teach and instruct the next generation of Vestals. Their most important duty was as the guardians of the sacred fire of Vesta that would burn for an eternity in the city of Rome. After their office had expired, the Vestals were free to leave the order and marry, but many chose to stay for life instead. The few who did leave, it is said, would live miserable lives full of regret and melancholy. The first two Vestals ordained by Numa were Genia and Verenia. Canuleia and Tarpeia would succeed them. There would only be 4 Vestals at any given time for all of Numa's reign, and many of his successors, until later the office would increase to 6. Thanks to the service of the Vestal Virgins, they did get compensation decided upon by Numa. The Vestals could write a will during the lifetime of their father. Normally, women were the property of their fathers before they had married, but the Vestals had the privilege to administer their own affairs. There were also other powers vested in the Vestal office. For example, if a Vestal Virgin were traveling on the roads and met a criminal headed for execution, his life would be spared, if the Vestal in question could speak an oath that the meeting was an accidental one. The Vestals were not all powerful though, as is seen in the case of what would happen if they committed a crime. If a Vestal would commit any offense or crime, she would only be punished by the Pontifex Maximus, the highest religious authority in Rome. Usually the punishment would be a whipping. It would take place in a dark room with a curtain between the pontiff and the Vestal, so as not to be seen naked. But if a Vestal committed the most unthinkable crime and broke her vow of virginity, something far worse would be awaiting her. The Vestal in question would be tied to a litter. Her mouth would be covered so she could not speak. She would be taken to the forum where people would accompany the procession in silence and sorrow. After the forum, the Vestal would be led to the Colin Gate, where close by a room under the ground marked by a mound of dirt had been prepared for her execution. Inside the room there would be a bed, a lamp, bread, water, milk and oil, so something that had been devoted to a sacred religious service before her great sin would not have to die by starvation. The Vestal would have her cords loosened and made to go into the room. The Pontifex Maximus would utter a prayer for himself, not for the Vestal, and look away as the stairs into the room would be pulled up by contraptions. Next, a heap of earth would cover the entrance, so that no one would be able to find the spot of the execution. The Vestal would die, most likely from suffocation. Such is the punishment for those who break a vow to the gods themselves. It is said that the day where a Vestal would be executed would be seen as one of the most sorrowful and gloomiest in the city. Having created the institutions of the Vestal Virgins, Numa also decided to build a temple for their worship. He constructed the Temple of Vesta. The temple was circular, and in the middle would be placed the sacred fire of Vesta. As long as the fire was lit, it would be seen as a sign that the goddess still favored the protection of Rome. The Vestals lived in this temple, and during the day they took visitors, but it was forbidden for any man to enter at night. The Vestals would not only worship the goddess Vesta in this temple, but also Libitina, the god of funerals and burials. The virgins would, because of this worship, also advise the Roman people on funeral rites, so that a man passing into the underworld would be as peaceful as possible. Numa saw the connection to the gods below as something important, and therefore gave a sounder structure to all things connected to burials. He would also regulate the days of mourning for different people who had died. A child under the age of 3 was not to be mourned at all. A child between the age of 3 and 10 would be mourned just as many months as it was years old when it died. For anyone else, mourning would not exceed 10 months. It was also decided that if a widow wanted to remarry before the 10 months of mourning had concluded, which was a standard for the death of a husband, she had to sacrifice a cow pregnant with a calf. Numa, the hater of violence which he was, also created the priest order of the Ficials. These priests were just as much diplomats as religious servants. The Ficials were the guardians of peace. If another city, group or tribe had started a dispute with Rome, it was the work of the Ficials to settle the matter with words instead of war. Only if this failed could the Romans declare war, after the Ficial priest had called the gods to witness the try but failure of the diplomatic endeavor. Without the consent of the Ficials, no king or soldier could take up arms against an enemy. Only with their agreement was war declared, and authority to violence was given to the commander of the said war. This is where the Roman tradition and belief that they only fought the defensive wars started, because with the Ficial priests they had always tried to end hostilities with diplomacy. In the 8th year of Numa's reign, his piety would be tested harder than ever before. This year, 707 BC, a great pestilence would ravage Italy. Numa received a message from the goddess Egeria. She sent a sacred shield that fell from the sky into Numa's hands. The message told him to create 11 counterfeits of the shield to keep it safe from theft. A master artificer named Mamurius Veturius managed to create such counterfeits that not even Numa himself could spot the difference between them and the original relic. The safety of these shields and its copies would be the work of a new college of priests, the Sali. Doing this, Rome was saved from the pestilence ravaging the lands. During the month of March, one particular day every year, the 12 Sali that Numa appointed from the patrician class would carry the relics through the city while dancing and singing, as a tribute to the gods for saving the city from disease and death. The college of the Sali would evolve into warrior priests, something that is described in more detail in my video Romulus' Armies. Having created so many new priesthoods, Numa built beside the temple of Vesta a king's house, or regia. Here, Numa would spend his days in religious service. He would instruct and advise the now many priests of the city and converse with his subjects. From this house, Numa would also, when the time was right, send out criers to inform the people to stop everything they were doing and join together in religious service. In his opinion, the only true way to appease the gods was to have a person's mind fully occupied with religious fervor. Therefore, he had to drop everything he was doing and focus just on the divine subject at hand. In his new house, Numa would also philosophize and always come up with new regulations and instructions for prayers and sacrifices. Some examples being to sit down after prayer as to be connected with the earth itself, and to turn around during adoration to the gods, probably as to more clearly be able to worship the many different gods in the pantheon. In his royal house, surrounded by the temples and priests, the people were sure of the divine authority given to Numa and believed that everything could be possible with him as king. There are stories of him miraculously filling rooms with the finest of meat and wine when he was holding a gathering for guests. Another story tells of how Numa would surprise two satyrs called Picus and Faunus, who were running around Italy creating mischief and playing tricks with drugs and magic. Numa, trapping them by getting them drunk of wine by switching their spring water with the alcohol, would have them tell him of a charm to create thunder and lightning. Conducting the charm, Jupiter himself was brought down from heaven, where he told Numa he now had to pay with the heads of men for casting such a spell. Numa, always being wise, tricked Jupiter with wordplay that he had learned from Egeria. Jupiter would return to Olympus, and Numa would be left unscathed. Numa's work as the divine king would never end, for he argued that the service to the gods never ended. On one occasion, it is said that when Numa got news that enemies were approaching, he simply answered, "And I am sacrificing." Religious duty always came first. After the construction of the royal house, the building projects would not cease. 3 more temples would be built, one for Faith, one for Janus, and the last for Terminus. Numa saw the worship of Faith as being extremely important. He told the Roman people that swearing in the name of Faith was the most solemn oath they could ever utter. The temple to Janus had 2 doors that would stand open during times of war and be closed during peacetime. During Numa's reign, the doors were always closed. Romulus, having first prescribed the boundaries of Rome with his many conquests, had never made true work to set them in stone. Numa, with his new temple to Terminus, the god of boundaries, could conduct sacrifices to the god to keep Rome's new borders stable. Inside the Roman borders, Numa would divide the land between the commonalty, wishing them to farm and work the land with husbandry. These new farmers were called the Pagi. He would also ordain chief overseers that would help keep the farms profitable. Numa himself would often inspect the new farms and bestow honors upon those who had worked the land given to them well. A farmer now had incentive to defend his land from enemies instead of being too occupied going out in raids and pillages. With this ruling, Numa had created a peaceful population, occupied in working the lands and in religious service, but not afraid or incapable to defend the boundaries of Rome when times called for it. While Romulus had been king, he had divided his city into 3 tribes, one Latin, one Sabine, and one mostly Etruscan. This was a good choice in Romulus' time, because it gave all the people in his city a feel of importance and influence, but it had now grown into factionalism. The tribes had a hard time cooperating with each other, as seen during the interregnum. Numa decided that to fix this problem, he would create many guilds. The guilds would divide all the people in Rome into groups connected to their trade. Inside these guilds, the different tribes would mix and force a cooperation between them that until this point had not existed. The different guilds were those of musicians, goldsmiths, carpenters, dyers, shoemakers, skinners, braziers, and potters. Instead of being 3 different people, everyone now instead truly became Roman. The distinction between different persons was moved from tribe to trade, which did not cause as much ill blood. Another thing Numa did, which brought him much love from the people, was to amend the law that gave the power to fathers to sell their children into slavery. In the amendment, Numa changed it, so if a son had married, his father could not sell him. Numa did not see it as right or fair that a woman would be married to a free man just so his father sold him into slavery, which would make the married woman now have to live with a slave. Another thing Numa put into law was that some days during the year would be considered as unlawful days. On these days, no public business or transactions could be conducted. Numa foresaw that it would be good for the people if some days they did not have to keep their mind on these particular burdens. Even though Numa Pompilius focused most of his reign on religious service and turning the Roman people into pious and faith-driven folk, he also had other ideas he wanted to implement into his society. During the rule of Romulus, the Romans had no exact number of days in their months. The only set number was that one year contained 360 days, but the days in one month depended on how the astronomers in the city believed the sun and moon at that current time to be positioned. When the seasons and its months and dates were brought out of alignment because of the unstructured calendar, the priests of the city would add additional months as needed. This was a quick fix, but never solved the inherent problem of the Roman calendar. Numa therefore decided upon creating a new calendar, more set in stone around the motions of the solar and lunar year. The Romans first had only 10 months in a year, and it is believed Numa added the months of January and February before March to make the year have our current 12 months. February became a month of purification and honoring of the dead, while January was a month dedicated to Janus for his love of the arts and of peace. Having built temples, created priesthoods, inscribed a new respect for the gods into the minds of the people, and brought peace to the city, Numa could confidently say that Rome had been enlightened by his rule. During his 43-year reign, the city had grown, so much in fact that Numa had to extend the walls to include the Quirinal Hill. Not once did the trumpets of war sound. What was heard instead were the hymns of prayer. As Rome found itself with a new kind of respect, one of religious and blessed people, Numa's teachings began to spread all over the countryside. It is said that during this time all of Italy began finding itself in a more peaceful state. Instead of pillaging and looting, the tribes were working the land, partaking in festivals and servicing the gods. Numa's spirit had spread itself like a calm wind all over the peninsula. Numa's private life, although less talked about, is still somewhat known. It is believed that Numa had 5 children, 1 daughter named Pompilia, and 4 sons by the name Pompo, Pinus, Calpus, and Mamercus. These 4 sons would each start the respective lineage of the Pomponi, Pinari, Calpurni, and Mamerci families. Pompilia would marry the son of Marcus, one of Numa's friends, who had argued for him to accept the title of king. His son and Pompilia would themselves have a child named Ancus Marcius, who would become a future king of the city. Numa was both a king and philosopher. He was loved by both the people and Senate. Numa would never find himself in danger of any assassination attempt or ill will from anyone. Just by his existence, Numa created great men around him. Just by conversing or hearing the king speak, men rose to the best versions of themselves. No other tribe would try to encroach on Rome's land or take control over the city. Numa and his city were after all protected by the gods themselves, or so it was believed. Even if Numa was protected by the gods, he was still a mortal man, and the threads of fate had an end for him too. At the age of 81 in the year 673 BC, after having been Rome's king for 43 years, Numa would die by old age, in a gentle decline into the underworld. Numa's funeral was a grand and honor-filled spectacle. Allies and friends from many cities surrounding Rome would come bringing presents to the city, who had just lost their divine king. The senators would carry their monarch's corpse on a bier. Behind them, the priests of the many priesthoods would follow, and behind them, the people of Rome followed in a long, heartbroken procession. At Numa's own command, 2 coffins of stone had been carved out, one for his body and one for his many books full of his own knowledge. He had already told his priests all they needed to know from his writings, and did not want them to be freely circulated around for any lesser man to read. Such was the life of Numa Pompilius, divine monarch, servant of the gods and bringer of peace. Never again would the people and city of Rome find itself in as peaceful of a time as during King Numa's reign. Numa had taught his subjects the importance of spirituality and religion. He had given them a society worth protecting and expanding. If Romulus was the founder of Rome, Numa was the creator of what it meant to be Roman. He knew that a city blazed in war and violence would never stand the test of time. But if his people were fighting for something more, an idea of Rome itself, they would become a light that would civilize the world. With the gods now holding their back, and the people united in the same spirit, Rome might just be able to grasp at Imperium and conquer the world.